All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Marvelous Music for Season 2. I've got my coffee, I've got my water, and I've got a brand new series that I'd like to tell you all about today. So, as you'll know if you've been listening to the podcast for any length of time or since the beginning, I started out by breaking down and discussing just some of my favorite movies of all time, which was a blast, and it really gave me the footing that I needed to start off just feeling comfortable with sharing videos on the show. We took the month of October, did a bunch of classic horror movies, broke down those soundtracks. That was a lot of fun. And then over the last couple of months, I've been taking a break and trying to figure out what to do next. So as I've talked about before, I used to be a full-time creative, which meant that I was pretty much in touch with my creative process in a very quick and efficient way. Now that I'm not a full-time creative, it takes a little bit longer to kind of shake the rust off. So that's probably why it's taken a little bit longer than I expected to come up with a new idea. I think originally I was just going to take off the month of December, something like that, and then it ended up being like all of November, all of December, and now most of January, other than making appearances on Marvelous Podcast, which has been a blast, but haven't done any Marvelous Music in a while. So part of my creative process, or being able to do anything creative, is that I have to be really passionate about at least a portion of a project, if not the whole project. So like when I used to work in theater full-time, I may or may not have cared about 90% of the shows that I worked on because we did so many. But if I could find like a set design or even just a piece of a set that I was really into, or maybe a bit of lighting design that was super complicated and interesting and cool to look at, if I could get excited and passionate about one element of a project, it would energize me to do the rest of it and carry on through the rest of it. Fortunately, with this idea that we're about to jump into, I'm kind of excited about the whole thing, and I'm excited about the work that'll go into making it happen on like the research side and the movies I'll be watching and soundtracks I'll be listening to. I'm really excited for that. But I'm really excited to try to put these together in a series that makes sense and has a good point to it, instead of just kind of going through and reviewing soundtracks to random movies or something like that. This is, we'll be doing that and taking a lot of what we've done before and doing it again in terms of how we break down scores and stuff like that. But we'll be doing it with more of a theme and a direction for the next several weeks. It'll take a while to get through all of this. So a while back, I put out a mini-sode on the YouTube channel. It gave sort of a brief overview of my frustrations with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In particular, the scores of the movies. To briefly sum it up, I thought it was a huge missed opportunity that the first three phases don't really keep themes established for the main Avengers characters. So Thor, Iron Man, Captain America, none of them really have a musical continuity throughout their trilogies. And then it's rarely, if ever, that any of the musical language from their individual films gets used in like the big team-up movies, the Avengers movies. And I thought that was like a huge missed opportunity. And you see that in the other characters' films as well, but those are the ones that have gotten like full-on trilogies at this point so far. So those are the ones that are easiest to pick on, I guess. Even if it sacrificed some creative license, it would be worth it to have the themes grow and evolve with the characters, to have a musical language for each character in an event film that we've already got an emotional connection to. The only decent reason that I could think of for not having a film-to-film continuity of music would be so that each film could have its own impressive boundary-pushing type of soundtrack, but we didn't really get any of those until phase 3, and then really only a couple of them. I can think of like Black Panther, the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. Those were very, maybe Thor 3. Those were very unique and interesting and cool, different sounding soundtracks. And the soundtracks themselves sold in record numbers, much like the movies. So obviously there was a payoff to having these super well-crafted soundtracks that it paid off for Marvel. Only one of the Iron Man movies has a consistently interesting score. Same with Captain America. It's the first one. Similarly with Thor, it's not until the third one that you really get anything that's really interesting or memorable sounding. So it's almost like it wasn't until 6 or 7 years into the process that composers finally realized they had complete creative freedom with the soundtracks. They didn't have to try to fit into a certain mold like the stories did, because apparently no one was paying attention to the musical continuity throughout the first few phases of the MCU. Now that we're in phase 4 with the Disney Plus shows, 4 movies in just this last year, you can hear that composers are starting to do all they can to work in little pieces of music from previous movies, especially if an older character shows up or something like that. The problem is, because there's been no continuity across the last 11 years, you miss most of the musical illusions that they make, because you just haven't had time to associate that music with any of the characters, because it doesn't get repeated. It doesn't get done over and over again in their solo films. So when they bring it back for an illusion in the middle of a Disney Plus show, or in No Way Home or something like that, you've had no time to get attached to the musical ideas. So when they bring it back, you don't even recognize it. There's no emotional connection to it. Now, there are exceptions to that, I think. When you hear, like, Doctor Strange's theme with that cool harpsichord sound, because it's such a unique instrument that you don't hear very often anymore, I think you know it's Doctor Strange, because it is such a unique theme and a unique instrument that it's being used for it. I think that kind of thing needs to happen all over the place for all the characters. I think all these characters should have some kind of musical idea attached to them that is easily recognizable in a few notes, so that if I don't know, pick a random character, even like someone like Daredevil when he showed up in No Way Home, like if there was a musical, couple of bars that was just so obviously recognizable, like that's Daredevil's theme, and you hear that as you're moving into that scene in No Way Home, it adds a layer of emotional connection. It bridges you to the Daredevil show's source material in a way that just seeing him on the screen couldn't do. And imagine if they would have done that for every single character and built up that emotional connection to that music and that character, and then by the time you get to Endgame, you'd be in tears even more than you already were through the whole thing. So that's why it's a huge wasted opportunity, in my opinion. I think there is some effort now to sort of right the ship of the MCU music, but we'll see if it's successful moving forward, or if they just got too far along before actually making an effort for it to make a difference. Now, what are we going to be looking at moving forward? What's this series? I promise it's not me just ragging on the MCU films for the next several weeks. I just don't have space in my mind for that kind of negative energy at this point. But as far as what we're going to be doing, when we were doing our Eternals review, me and Ben on the Marvelous podcast a few weeks ago, Ben brought up the introduction of Mahershala Ali's Blade character in the end credits sequence with the Black Knight in Eternals. That got me thinking back to the original Blade trilogy with Wesley Snipes, which I kind of grew up with. I saw him way earlier than I should have seen them, but I saw them when I was a kid. And I totally loved them because they're just these crazy, amazing action movies. So I decided it'd be kind of cool to go back and and watch those movies, maybe even break them down and do episodes of them on the show. But then that kind of got me thinking further. He's not really the first or only MCU or Marvel character to get an MCU reboot. There's been a lot of them at this point. You've got Hulk, Daredevil, Spider-Man, Captain America, the Fantastic Four soon enough, Punisher soon, again, the X-Men, Ghost Rider potentially. Those are all going to have shiny new MCU versions here in the near future. And I remembered that the Blade movies had what I thought, at least at the time, were pretty awesome soundtracks. And considering all the rebooted or soon-to-be rebooted properties, I thought it would be interesting to take a look back to the pre-MCU Marvel movies and analyze the soundtracks and compare them somewhat to the soundtracks of the MCU. I initially thought that it wouldn't be fair to compare multiple movies across multiple decades to the MCU movies that were all developed in a fairly compact amount of time and all feed into one continuous story. But if we break it down a little deeper, there's a lot of room for comparison. First, as I've already brought up, there doesn't seem to be any attempt at musical continuity in the MCU until very late in the process and now currently. So on that point, there's really no issue in comparing those scores to the scores of the older Marvel movies. Second, I think it'll be interesting to compare the series within the series. So it'll be interesting to see how, say, the Blade trilogy, the Spider-Man trilogy, the X-Men trilogy, how those movies either maintain a musical continuity or don't maintain a musical continuity, but see how music develops across those trilogies. Then compare that to, say, Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Ant-Man, Guardians, whatever. An MCU trilogy or close to trilogy that may or may not have a good musical continuity to it. And just look at that comparison and say, so I can say, for instance, I know that the Spider-Man trilogy, I think, does a pretty good job of maintaining a musical continuity and building on it with each successive film. So it'll be interesting to go back and watch those three movies, analyze the evolution of those scores, and see, by the time we get to Spider-Man 3, even though it's regarded as probably the weakest in the series, is the music giving me more of an emotional resonance than it would if it was just brand new. Like in Iron Man 3, which has a completely different soundtrack from Iron Man 1 and 2. So there's no emotional connection between the audience and the music that's underneath these films. Will the one-off superhero movies have a bolder or more memorable musical choice or choices than the incredibly well-funded MCU? Are there any hidden musical gems in some of these 90s and 2000s films that we just have to bring to attention before they're buried under hours and hours of MCU content? These are all the sorts of questions and ideas that I'm really interested in trying to answer with this series and see what we find. Now, outside of Blade, Spider-Man, the X-Men films, I haven't seen most of these movies before. So this is a new experience for me, and I'm incredibly excited about it. I've already finished the Blade trilogy. I'm working on my episode for that. That'll come out next week. It's made me so excited to dive into the rest of these movies, even the maybe not so good ones, we'll see. Because the scores of those movies really contain some cool ideas and exciting pieces of music. Stuff that still kind of pops into my head, even though it's been several days or even weeks since I've seen the movies. So like I said, we'll be starting by looking at the Blade trilogy probably next week. Then over the next several weeks, we'll be looking into the Spider-Man trilogy, Sam Raimi, the X-Men movies. I'm probably just going to do 1 through 3. We'll do Daredevil, Elektra, Hulk, Ghost Rider, the two Fantastic movies from the mid-2000s. Those should be amazing. Really excited. And then what I'm calling the dark films. So that's going to be the Dolph Lundgren Punisher that ran out of production money and never got an official US release. It only released in Europe, I believe. The Captain America film from '92, the unreleased Fantastic Four movie that was made just to maintain the rights, Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., Man-Thing, Generation X, and Howard the Duck. Sure enough, we're going to go with that. Some of these were actually really hard to find, by the way, and I ended up having to like scour eBay for DVD copies, because there's a few of these movies that are not available to stream anywhere, which kind of blew my mind. And what I want to do with this analysis is show, hopefully, how the pre-MCU series maintained musical themes throughout their films, but also how the lack of continuity or universe between all these other MCU movies may have allowed the composers a greater freedom to craft really unique and creative pieces of music in these scores. And since I'm sure studio execs and composers of MCU movies listen to this podcast, maybe give some lessons that can be learned from the Marvel dark ages of the Wild West time before the MCU took over the comic book movie world. And look, I'm not ignorant to the fact that a lot of these are considered bad movies. And what I may end up finding in a lot of them is generic, dated scores that really hold no weight and are completely forgettable. But when held up against especially the early MCU, I don't think that's going to make much of a contrast. So, at the very least, we'll be able to say that even though the story achievements of the MCU are a major step forward, the music is about on par with unreleased films from the early 90s. Or, I'll be able to pop on this podcast and say, hey, remember that Ben Affleck Daredevil movie? Yeah, it's as bad as you remember. But the soundtrack actually probably deserved an Oscar. And here's something from that soundtrack that they should totally learn from and integrate into future movies. And I think in some ways it'll be refreshing to kind of go back and watch these movies from, I guess, a simpler time in the world of comic book films, if that's not too cheesy to say, where a film just got the green light and the people making it threw the kitchen sink at it because it had to stand up on its own and make money or get lost to time, as opposed to now where you can make a forgettable MCU film, but it can fall back on fitting into a larger universe of stories. That's the thing with MCU movies too. If one is forgettable, it doesn't matter because they can just stop making solo films and integrate the main character of it into other properties however they see fit. Like, look at Mark Ruffalo's Hulk as an example. The Edward Norton Hulk did not do as well as they wanted it to, and then Ed Norton didn't want to come back to the character, so they recast Mark Ruffalo, and he hasn't had a solo film since. You wouldn't see that pre-MCU. The character would just disappear or get rebooted again. But when a Hulk movie got made in 2003, they got Ang Lee to direct it, who would go on to win an Oscar for Best Picture for Life of Pi. So they had a future Oscar-winning director on board for this, what became, I don't know, an avant-garde Hulk movie, which probably wasn't the way to go, but they know that now. But they didn't know that at the time, so they just went with this super artistic director that, had an idea, and they went for it, and it was huge, in scope at least. And say what you will about Daredevil or Elektra or Ghost Rider, but Ben Affleck, Jennifer Garner, Nicolas Cage, they were like top of the A-list actors when they signed on to be in these movies. They were not, kind of where they are now in their acting careers. They were at the top, and they signed on to do these superhero movies. So they were really throwing everything they had into these movies when they made them. And the composers of some of these movies are all-time greats. So Blade 3 alone has, the Blade trilogy alone has 3 different composers, one for each movie. Mark Isham, who composed the original, also composed one of my all-time favorites, Warrior, which we did an episode on several weeks back now. The second was composed by the same guy who did the soundtrack for Logan and A Quiet Place and like a ton of other really famous movies that you would actually be shocked by if you went through his IMDb filmography. The X-Men theme is one of the only superhero themes that I can easily remember and start humming right off the top of my head. And Danny Elfman did the Spider-Man movies. Danny Elfman, one of the all-time great composers. So these composers, for the most part, knew they had to create something audiences would remember and want to hear more of, because they couldn't just collect the check and let their score fade into the obscurity of a cinematic universe. The MCU has done bigger things than most existing film franchises have ever been able to do. And I love Marvel movies, but they definitely have room to grow in the soundtrack department. And I personally have a hard time hating on movies, so that mini-sode on the MCU was particularly hard to make and kind of robbed me of some energy, just because my opinion had to be so negative about it. And with this new series, I'm really hoping to go back and just have a fun time with even the worst of the Marvel Dark Ages, and hopefully I'll find some musical gems that I didn't know were there. So that's just kind of a brief overview of what we're going to be doing in the next several weeks in a series for Marvelous Music. When I initially plotted this out, it was set at 10 episodes, including this one. The more I think about it, the more I'm leaning towards stretching that out to 12 to 14, just because I had like 4 or 5 movies packed into certain weeks. We'll see how that ends up panning out. Some of them are just ones that, off the top of my head, I'm prejudging and not expecting to find anything very interesting in. So I don't want to take up, or try to come up with a bunch of material for a single episode when there wasn't much to talk about in the soundtrack, because that would just be boring. But I also just don't know, like, watching 4 or 5 movies a week to do the podcast on it, plus writing it and all that is a ton. So we'll see how it pans out. It could be 10 episodes. It could be 14 or 15 episodes. We'll see. Probably going to try to throw in some guests here and there to talk about different pieces of it, so you're not just listening to my voice every time. And I think we'll see how it goes with some of the individual ones that I haven't seen before, but in just my early watching of some of these movies, I think each one of these episodes is going to actually have like a theme or a lesson, if you will, that kind of bonds the whole thing together. And so that's gonna make it really interesting. So it's not just here's a breakdown of the score, here's what happened, here's what I thought was cool. Bye, enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. I think there will actually be a theme to kind of mine out from a lot of this material. So really interested to jump into that, and really interested to just learn a lot. We're in a really cool time with comic book movies, especially, where we can do this comparative analysis between a current ongoing franchise and stuff that came before it or led up to it. And another thing that I think is really cool is I've looked all over the place over the last several weeks trying to find someone who's done a similar type of analysis. You can find people that have done like breakdowns of the Spider-Man scores, maybe X-Men, but no one that's done a really in-depth analysis comparing the original, like, old school Marvel scores to current Marvel scores. It's not out there anywhere. So this is really exciting to be able to work on a project that, as far as I can tell, has not been worked on before. So it's not even just, providing my opinion and my take on something that you could find a dozen other opinions on. This is a new thing, so I'm really excited to jump into it. That pretty much gives you an idea on what's going to be going on here. If you want to interact with this, as we go along, talk about some of these movies when you saw them, stuff you liked about them, stuff you hated about them. Has your opinion on them changed over time or changed since the MCU was a thing? Like, when I was a kid growing up, I loved the two Fantastic Four movies from the 2000s. I still kind of do, not gonna lie. But I see a lot of people hating on them now that we have the MCU, and they're super excited for whatever the MCU is gonna do with the Fantastic Four. And I'm like, just because there might be a different or objectively better version of it out there coming down the line doesn't mean that in a way the other version wasn't also good. So I think I'm going to be playing a lot of defense with some of these, especially early 2000s movies as well, and just kind of being like, hey, it's really not that bad, and it's kind of fun, and here's what's fun about it and what we can enjoy about it, or laugh at about it. Doesn't matter. Just because something different or better exists now does not make something that came before it bad or irrelevant. And I think that's something I want to try to draw out with this series. So I'd love to have people interacting with it as we go through. But yeah, that's kind of what's going to be going on over the next several weeks. I'm really excited to jump into it. We'll be talking about the Blade trilogy next week. Do all the things as far as liking, subscribing, sharing, all that stuff. Even if you just share when the episode comes out, it's a huge help. Tell your friends about it. Yeah. Thank you for listening, and I do hope that you have a great rest of your Tuesday. Marvelous Music is back.